exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Sifu, T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 89. If this is your first time here at Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. Some of the sharpest martial artists in the world participate and listen to this program, and I know because they send me emails, they challenge me in different ways almost every week, and you're part of that family now. Here we look at some of the history, the impact, the culture, and adventure of martial arts. Well, what's the difference between history, stories, and legends? One of the big differences is that history will change as new developments and understandings occur. But for a lot of folks that like to stay in the dark, they would just rather stay blind to the history, the developments, and the influence of a martial art, and just regurgitate the same old stories, even if they've been proven totally false. Or if some smart folks come along and say, hey, you might want to look at it this way too. This episode is going to go back and look at some legends, stories, and the massive influences which blended together to develop a martial art that we know as karate. In particularly, practical, applicable karate. Now, I emphasize this only because the research presented during this episode will move through 1,000 years of history and stories, from about 600 AD to 765 AD, all the way up to the development of the Shurite style of karate. During no point during this research did I find any reference to karate for sport or karate for show. I am not saying that it didn't exist. What I am saying is that a very smart guy who lives in the region, has his PhD in cultural anthropology, loves his martial arts, and has no vested interest whether you practice karate or not, never mentioned once sport karate in his thesis as he covers this 1,000-year span. Now, we will see where it goes in the next episode, but as far as this one goes, that's where we're at. But before we move forward, a word from our listeners. Hey Sifu, I just wanted to express my sincere thanks for the work you're doing and continuing to do with these podcasts. You have definitely helped me on my personal martial arts journey, and I'm sure that you've helped many others. You've helped me both to find my way back to martial arts and given me valuable guidance on planning my future on my martial arts journey. Even though I just discovered Kung Fu Podcast about 4 or 5 months ago, I've made my way through the entire catalog for both Kung Fu Podcast and Tibetan Kung Fu. They were like my daily meditation practice, and I look forward to going over in more detail the specific podcasts that interest me the most. So, to my request, I discovered your podcast when I was doing research to answer a specific question I had. Can I train competitively for powerlifting and train my martial arts as well for self-defense, meditation, and philosophy? Even though your podcast on strength training and martial arts addressed the question somewhat, I still wondered if you could dig up any research on anyone doing strength sports competitively like Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, bodybuilding, or strongman competitions, and practicing martial arts regularly, and then still coping with their busy lives as we all seem to have now. I haven't had any luck so far. There's more to the question, of course, because there are factors in this equation specific for me that I feel will be too long-winded to express here. If you have the time in future, I hope I can get a chance to correspond with you via email to explain a bit more. In the meantime, please keep doing the awesome work that you've been doing. It's much appreciated. I especially like listening to episodes that impact your son, because I'm a new dad at 42 years old with a 10-month-old. Loving every minute of it, and I really hope to be the best father I can possibly be to him. If you ever wish to share this info on the podcast, please feel free. I just ask that you exclude my name, Mr. Kung Fu Podcast Listener. Well, Mr. Listener, first, congratulations on being a dad. It's an adventure. It is something that is reflective. And if you practice martial arts, I think that you'll find that you can use particularly the inner development of your martial arts in yourself as a way to help you better relate as you go forward. In regards to your strength training question in martial arts, apparently you've already listened to the one on strength training and its effective martial arts. You might also listen to the one we just did last week where Mr. Ian Abernathy and I were discussing how weight training and things like that affected our martial arts. And Ian, along the way, actually made a comment, something along the lines that he was even given the guidance to start his strength training because it would give some of his techniques more authority. But I will say this, in regards to your question as how I'm taking it, you will have to decide which ones are your priority. Are you doing martial arts to help your powerlifting and your bodybuilding? So like if you're a bodybuilder, you can use martial arts as a way to put on a better presentation. Or you are martial artist first, and the Olympic weightlifting or the powerlifting, the building, what is that there for? Where is it on the priority list? You have to make sure that you have your priorities squared away. One thing about it, if you've got more than 2 or 3 priorities, you have none. They cannot all be important. You have to decide which one is most important, which one comes second, which one comes third. But as soon as you sense that you're saying to yourself, oh, well, all of these are important, then guess what? None of them are. And to each and every one of you, I genuinely appreciate all of your support and your feedback. You can support this program any way you want. You can go to kungfupodcast.com/contact, get in touch with me, leave a review. You can go to /support and find different ways that you can support this program. You can also leave a review over on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you listen to this program. A lot of them will have a little place where you can leave a review about this program. And if you feel good about it, I would love for you to leave a review. I try to read everything I can find that you all share. In the development of this program, I made an announcement last week that I have paid to enroll and signed up for classes with a professional actor, producer, and a professional coach, Mr. Pat Fraley. I'm going to be getting some real coaching now, and I'm also going to be officially out of my comfort zone, which is a good thing. One thing we know as martial artists, right? If you're comfortable, you're not working hard enough. You're not pushing hard enough. Get uncomfortable, push those zones out there a little bit, and you'll feel a lot better about where you're going. As I was just speaking about pushing comfort zones, one of the folks that I've met over these past couple of months is Miss Kai Morgan, who has a very good blog at budoinochi.com. She and I have exchanged several emails, and she had written an article back on March 2016 titled How One Woman's Bad Karate Suddenly Became My Heart's Desire. I want to send a shout out to Kai because I'm sure she's probably listening. And she has an excellent list of blog stories that I think any martial artist could find some value in. From what I've gathered, she's primarily an Aikido practitioner, but she's also began her karate. And this was one of the interesting stories I thought I would share with you. Her Aikido sensei took her to a field trip to watch 3 black belts in grading. And it says, quote, "The first is a middle-aged guy who moves in gracefully, controlled in a powerful way, like a big, beautiful tiger. The second is a younger man who moves faster, like an edgy, hot-blooded boxer, which is also beautiful and powerful, but in a different way. The third student is a woman, but she doesn't look good at all," end quote. Now, the 2 guys have a range of forms and strikes, and the woman only has a few in a form that is described as mediocre. But then the sparring came, and this woman sets a face, a tone. And Kai says she looks scary and very fierce. The woman makes it to the other side of the room through the sparring with just pure grit and determination. Kai writes about how she needed to learn what this woman knew, and she went to talk to her. And here's what she wrote. Quote, "She trains 3 times a week and often ends up in tears of frustration, sometimes at the technical challenges and sometimes at her own lack of flexibility and athleticism," end quote. The woman passed her grade because all 3 of these folks had the same tenacity and fighting spirit. The other thing the woman did is she inspired a spark to someone younger who will probably carry this for many, many years to come. So whenever you're conducting yourself out in your dojos, your kwuns, wherever you practice, even in a park, and some young folks are walking by, it's always good to remind yourself that you might be the spark for a fuse that will run for a long time in the future. And that's part of the reason why that we have this program right here, is that one day, as I've said before, I'll be dead and gone. And I hope that there is one of you who will reach out there, Keep inspiring good folks who practice martial arts of any style, of any system, to keep working hard and to keep moving on. And now to the meat of the program, a thesis titled Constructing a Martial Art Tradition, Rethinking a Popular History of Karate-Do. Now, I saw this 24-page essay when I was researching episode 87, Marginalization in Martial Arts, and I mentioned him in there. I reached out to Dr. Tan, and he agreed to let me share his research with you. But first, a little bit about the man behind the thesis. Dr. Kevin S.Y. Tan is a cultural anthropologist and faculty member at SIM University in Singapore. He completed his bachelor's and master's degree at the Department of Sociology of the National University of Singapore and obtained his Ph.D. in cultural anthropology from the University of Alberta. His research interests include martial arts, religion, social gerontology, which I have no idea what that is, and I should have looked it up, and multiculturalism. Boy, that's a tongue twister, too. As the title implies, Dr. Tan is going to dig into the understandings of the martial traditions that we call karate, and we are going to follow him along through his research. He writes, "This essay seeks to explore and to rethink popular narratives that commonly surround the martial art known as karate, adopting a dynamic and less exclusive definition of terms such as culture or tradition. This thesis will provide a historically grounded understanding of karate's technical evolution, demonstrate socio-cultural trajectories and ideological foundations, and in doing so, this will reveal that contemporary and popular perceptions of karate as a martial tradition are more historically complex and politically contingent than what has often been widely accepted." Well, I can tell you that it's also important to remember that Dr. Tan is from Singapore. He starts the essay with a story from Togawa Yukio. Yukio writes about Funakoshi, who apparently would test himself against the elements. Everyone was in their homes during this thunderous Okinawan typhoon. Then Yukio writes, quote, "I was wrong when I said all the people of Shuri huddled at their home. There was one young man up on the roof of his house in Yamakawa-cho who was determinedly battling the typhoon. Anyone observing this solitary figure would surely have concluded that he had lost his wits. Wearing only a loincloth, he stood on the slippery tiles of the roof and held in both hands, as though to protect him from the howling wind, a tatami mat. He must have fallen off the roof to the ground time and again, for his nearly naked body was smeared all over with mud. The stance he took was most impressive, for he stood as if astride a horse. The wind struck the mat and the youth with full force, but he stood his ground and did not flinch." End quote. So that's how this essay starts, and my interpretation of Dr. Tan's next statements is that a modern conception is that karate is a Japanese culturally constructed martial art. Now, whether he is referring to exclusively that region of the world, or if this is a broader conception around the world, I'm not sure. But what he writes is, the central thesis of this essay asserts that in the face of political and historical contingencies, constitutive elements of culture or tradition, as in the case of an alleged martial tradition such as karate, are never well-bounded or rigid constructs. Hence, a major premise of my arguments contends that the contemporary and popular conceptions of karate as a, quote, genuine Japanese cultural construct, end quote, are more recent historical and political inventions than what is widely accepted. In the next few statements, Dr. Tan is going to be using an interesting word that received my attention. The term is insular, a synonym that basically means narrow-minded. Its definition is ignorant of or uninterested in cultures, ideas, or peoples outside of one's own experience, which implies that folks who are looking at the traditional construction of karate have not considered the contributions of others. Therefore, Dr. Tan writes, any scholarly attempt at retracing a history of karate must therefore require a non-insular and less exclusive definition of terms such as Japanese history, Japanese culture, and martial tradition. This is because any thorough reconstruction of karate's history must inevitably require, as it will be shown in this essay, the necessary inclusion of a complex interplay of Okinawan, Japanese, Chinese, and Western colonizing discourses, all which play significant roles in furthering our understanding of karate's historical and technical evolution. It was pretty obvious that he is pointing toward academics who are researching the construction of karate but are limiting themselves to just strictly the Japanese influence. Now, to help maintain the flow of this essay, I've read through it, and at the end, Dr. Tan has this laundry list of notes, where basically little sidebar notes where he found this and found that. What I did for you is I went ahead and pulled his notes into the places where he had inserted a reference to them, so that we could keep the flow of the thesis moving along. This next section starts with the translation of karate, and it's called Empty Hands. First, some definition and explication is in order with regard to karate, loosely translated in contemporary times as the way of the empty hand, or karate-do. It is one of the most widely practiced and popular martial arts in the world. It is considered to be a system of physical self-defense or combative skills that predominantly consist of striking techniques that involves the use of one's own bare hands, elbows, feet, and knees. Its namesake literally implies an emphasis on techniques in which no use of weapons is required. However, this can be misleading if one were to take into account a broader spectrum of its martial practices. This is Dr. Tan's first reference. His reference note says that the use of weapons in karate has always been a somewhat controversial point, as some modern karate styles in fact do practice the use of weapons, although this has become exceedingly rare. They refer to as kobujutsu or kobudo, which possess a strong link to historical Okinawan martial practices. The use of weapons such as the bow, the scythe, the nunchuck, the tafa, and the kama are some of the better-known weapons that are associated with the older forms of Okinawan martial practice. Now, coming up, he will reference author Don Draeger, who wrote Classical Budo, the Martial Arts and Ways of Japan, and he will also reference Dr. James Haynes, who I found referenced in the Asia-Pacific Research website in an article titled Zen and His Teachers. As Dr. Tan gets back to the label, Empty Hands, he says that it also appears to allude to more abstract and allegorical pretensions, for the word empty can be rationalized to view that it possesses Zen-like philosophical implications. Karate, from this perspective, therefore appears to exhibit certain transcendental interests other than existing in a physical, sensual universe. Hence, Funakoshi stated that just as it is the clear mirror that reflects without distortion, or the quiet valley that echoes a sound, so must one who study karate-do purge himself of selfish and evil thoughts, for only with a clear mind and conscience can he understand that which he receives. The essay moves forward toward the practice and training of karate. And he writes, the practice of karate usually takes place in two broad ways, either in kata or kumite. Kata refers to a stylized and formalized mode of practice where the karate practitioner, called a karateka, practices a set of fixed or choreographed movements that are supposed to emulate actual combat situations. Emphasis is thus placed on posture, balance, symmetry, focus, and a smooth execution of these movements. In essence, kata practice is a pedagogical teaching exercise that encompasses the honing of physical skills and a state of mind in which one is supposed to perform an idealized combative encounter without engaging in actual combat. A practitioner is expected to mentally project the application of these techniques as if they were being executed against an attacker. Encoded within a single kata is a series of incorporating practices where the various techniques of defense and attack are to be gradually and subconsciously embodied by the karateka from constant practice. There are roughly estimated 40 to 50 kata, with varying levels of difficulty, Although this number may change with the creation of new styles of karate, along with subsequent reinventions and reinterpretations over time, this, however, does not include the various forms of Kihon kata, or basic kata, that each karate style, or ryu, may emphasize for itself. Kihon kata are the kata that are often taught to new karateka as fundamental and elementary movements before proceeding on to more difficult and advanced kata. The number of Kihon kata for various karate styles may range from 20 to even none at all. There are also a number of more recent formulated karate styles from the latter half of the 20th century that have greatly de-emphasized kata on the whole as part of their core curriculum of practice. Kumite, on the other hand, refers to the practice of sparring between practitioners. Whereas the practice of kata emphasizes form and structure, Kumite stresses application, where movements are no longer fixed or stylized. Instead, it is now a situation when two karateka employ their skills against each other within a fighting arena. The practice of kumite can again range from a semi-structured form, such as one-step sparring, to that of jiu kumite, which is entirely unstructured, giving free rein to the imagination and individual application of one's techniques and stylistic preferences. The practice of jiu kumite is then often translated into a competitive framework in karate tournaments and has contributed greatly to its popularity, particularly from the 20th century onward. Depending upon the particular style that is organizing such an event, specific rules and regulations may apply differently, such as weight or rank divisions, gender differentiations, and even the mandatory use of fist guards and protective face masks. Competitive formats can range from semi-contact, point sparring system, or to full contact and or bare-knuckle fighting. Oftentimes at Kung Fu Podcast, we will refer to the differences between martial arts for health or martial arts for sports and traditional martial arts, particularly practical martial arts. As traditional martial artists, we will oftentimes also discuss how do we develop ourselves. Am I a better person because of the practice? Learning how to set goals or learn how to be patient. There's also the parts of working with others and operating yourself within a culture. That is all part of a traditional martial arts culture. Well, Dr. Tan, he makes a note here with regard to generally understanding karate as a practice, and it relates to the non-technical aspects of karate, such as the social cultural components that accompany the martial art. By this, Dr. Tan is referring to the present-day context of Japanese discourses that karate practice has embedded itself as part of the culture. In other words, the practice of karate does not simply entail the practice of bodily techniques of self-defense that are either stylized or unstructured. To simply focus only on the body techniques would fail to recognize its present-day popular identification as part of a Japanese or Oriental culture and tradition. Karate practice, therefore, consequently requires the karateka to incorporate into themselves an entire corpus of body, linguistic, and mental dispositions over an extended amount of time within a social environment bounded within the dojo. This is often expressed in the requirement for one to be initiated into various forms of cultural discourse, such as the wearing of the gi and the application of Japanese terminology in referring to either specific techniques, various kata, or the practice of dojo etiquette. Other aspects include the adoption of practices of bowing, kneeling, sitting, and even the various forms of bodily posture or physical carriage during the conduction of practice within a dojo. To a significant extent, then, the practice of karate is the practice of a broadly defined Japaneseness or Orientalism that is often perceived as a representation of Japanese tradition and culture in a popular sense. So as a note here, this again points to the perspective that many modern conceptions from where Dr. Tan is writing is that karate is of a Japanese construct. However, at this point, though, the essay goes into historical antecedents. He writes, however, as we extend our historical imagination beyond the confines of a mere contemporary apprehension of karate, our understanding of it grows much more complex. For any attempt to trace or reconstruct karate's historical trajectory is often harder than it appears. This becomes increasingly apparent from the lack of any detailed or specifically written records pertaining to its technical evolution. Such a state of affairs is also due to the fact that the learning of martial arts prior to the 20th century, in general, has been largely transmitted orally or through physical practice as opposed to being part of a textual tradition. Much of what is understood or can be learned, therefore, seems to stem from only two major sources: the historical and paramythological accounts linked to the island of Okinawa and its inhabitants, as well as a series of interconnected but often conflicting set of oral narratives passed down as traditional knowledge among karateka within their own subcultural enclaves, which only lately have attempts at recording and reflecting on such knowledge occurred. One must admit, therefore, that the history of karate is much more shrouded in vagueness than in clarity because of an obvious lack of reliable historical records. Coupled with this, substantive efforts among scholars and other popular writers to critically approach this topic has been limited. So much of what is deemed as common knowledge of karate origins, although not to be prejudiciously discarded, must always be apprehended in a more critical and careful manner. The earliest folklore and paramythologies that surround the history of karate are arguably linked in a very close way with the history of Okinawa. It's around 70 miles in length and an average of 7 miles in width. Okinawa is situated some 300 nautical miles from the island of Taiwan to the south and 300 nautical miles from Japan to the north, and it is some 400 miles from continental East Asia. Together with the other islands of the Ryukyu archipelago, Okinawa has been virtually on the crossroads of at least three major civilizations and their political, cultural, and religious influences in the past, and those were that of China, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula, and to a lesser extent, Southeast Asia. During pre-modern times and even earlier, the geographical uniqueness of Okinawa had often lent itself to be used as either a vital center for trade or as an important stopover, or island pathway for the replenishing of supplies and the gathering of information while en route between these major civilizations. Two civilizations in particular, China and Japan, were perhaps most closely tied to the history of Okinawa, with Japan overtaking China in influence over time. With its relatively smaller indigenous population and often weaker military might, the economic and cultural political interests of its immediate neighbors often dominated Okinawa's historical development. Therefore, Okinawan society has always been subjected to attempts at reinterpreting and restructuring itself in the face of various influence and even military invasions. From the unsubstantiated ancestral claims of an ancient kingdom alleged to be thousands of years old, to being subjected to the foreign policies of China and the Satsuma daimyo, as well as its eventual annexation by Japan in the late 19th century, the fate of Okinawan society has seldom been an independent one. Yet it was here, in the midst of such conjectures of culture and history, that the conditions for the emergence of what will subsequently be known as karate were laid. Most historical accounts or narratives usually direct our attention to the early impact of Chinese culture if one seeks to carefully reconstruct karate's origins. Researcher Kerr in 1965 gave mention to the discovery of knife-shaped coins known as Mai Tu Sen at Naha, one of the major towns of Okinawa. This raises the possibility that Okinawan contact with continental East Asia may have begun as far back as the 3rd century BC, as similar coins had also been manufactured during the Kingdom of Yin sometime in 265 BC. Kerr and other scholars further noted that by the time of the unification of China during the Qin dynasty, which was around 210 BC, accounts of imperial expeditions sent out into Eastern Sea in search of the secrets of immortality and alchemy has also been recorded. So now we're looking at artifacts that make a connection going back to as far as 3rd BC or 265 BC, and imperial accounts of expeditions that were sent out to the east, which would have put them in Okinawan's direction. Now, whether or not they made one of the other Ryukyu Islands or not, it would be hard to say, but they were heading in that direction, and of all things, they were looking for immortality and alchemy. But in another popular account, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was believed to have allegedly sent a mission of 3,000 men and women in search for the happy immortals who resided in the Eastern Sea. One version of this legend narrates that these vessels never returned and were alleged to have settled among the islands of Ryukyu Archipelago or even upon the island of Taiwan instead. From then on, legends of the happy immortals were to reappear and to capture the imagination of various Chinese dynasties throughout the rest of history, creating an inevitable paramythological narrative about the inhabitants of the Ryukyu Archipelago. There is another account and expedition which was alleged to have occurred during the Sui dynasty under the auspices of the Emperor Yongqin, but was believed to have ended in failure. Another expedition in 608 A.D., however, did return and was supposed to have encountered and fought against the inhabitants of an island that was claimed to be located between the islands of Japan and China. A number of captives were reported to have been brought back to China, and it was noted that these individuals did not speak or understand Chinese. Although referring to the Pacific Islands just east of the Asia continent as Liuqiu, which is Ryukyu in Japanese, it seems plausible that the Chinese expeditionary force had encountered either the island of Okinawa or at least one other major settlement along the Ryukyu archipelago. In addition, and around the same time, Japanese texts have also claimed of a, quote, Southern Islands people, end quote, sometime around 616 A.D., along with these accounts of barbarians who came in contact with the early Japanese settlements on the islands of Yaku and Tane. Kerr added that there seems to be evidence during the year 698 A.D. that official Japanese contact with these Southern Islands people, or Nanto people, had occurred. He notes that the Shaku Nihonji, which is translated as the Chronicles of Japan, records that a courtier named Fumi no Imiko was ordered to claim these islands with the aid of a small military force during the early years of the Naha period. More interestingly, it was also not until around 753 A.D., so what are we looking at, about 100 years, that the name Okinawa first emerged, and it was found recorded in a salvage journal that was in a shipwreck that was on a political mission on its way back from Naha to China during the reign of Empress Koken, or also known as Empress Shotoku. It was perhaps toward the end of the first millennium that Okinawan history became increasingly subjected to the influence and incursions by Chinese and Japanese interests. An example of such close political, cultural, and economic ties is noted in the supposed establishment of a Chinese mission at the port city of Naha during the late 14th century as a result of Okinawa's tributary alliances with its more powerful neighbors. It was also postulated by Kerr that subsequent inventions of a mythical dynasty in Okinawa that allegedly ruled for thousands of years prior to external colonizing interests. It was created because some Okinawans wanted to claim an alternative, native, historical, or cultural legacy that they could call their own. More accounts of Okinawa's past that are less infused with mythological rhetoric, but remain equally vague, however, are linked to a semi-historical narrative that surrounds the life of Shunten, the supposed founder of the first Okinawan kingdom around the year 1187. Shunten's life, whose birth date, according to tradition, was believed to be around 1166 A.D., was also supposedly to have been the son of Minamoto Tamitamo, who was the uncle of the more illustrious Minamoto Yoritamo of the Kamakura shogunate. According to popular legend, Minamoto Tamitamo had fled to Okinawa to escape persecution from the hands of the Tara during the Genpei War. Popular belief states that Tamitamo had sired a child with the daughter of a local chieftain, thus lending credence to subsequent claims of Japanese sovereignty over Okinawa. Kerr, along with a few other scholars, proposed an alternative interpretation. An educated guess on his part asserts that rather than being descendants of Minamoto, it was instead remnants of the defeated Tara navy at the hands of the Minamoto that had fled to the islands of the Ryukyu and settled there. Bonds were forged with the local chieftains between these military forces, resulting in the ascendancy of a dominant leader of Okinawa. According to Kerr, the claim of a historical lineage to Minamoto Tamatamo appears to be a much more recent invention, one that he suggests to have stemmed from later shogunates such as the Tokugawa, who were supposedly descendants of the Minamoto. Such an association between Okinawa nobility and the shogunate was certainly advantageous in the claiming of legitimacy over the rule of the archipelago. The myth of Shuntan's Minamoto lineage, therefore, more likely arose from a manipulation of history grounded in political interests rather than on something based on concrete and well-established evidence. Prior to the 15th century, Okinawa was roughly splintered into three distinct petty kingdoms known as Nanzan, Chusan, and Hakuzan. What resulted was a century of conflict throughout the 14th century. It was not until around the year 1429 that a Chusan king known as Hashi, or Shohashi, reunified the island again. The term Sho was actually a title which meant king's assistant, and was supposedly first bestowed upon King Sato of the Chusan by the Ming dynasty. This once more reveals the strong historical relationship the Okinawans shared with the Chinese, dating from Chusan's formal acknowledgement of the Ming dynasty's foreign policy since 1372. The social, cultural, and political relationships that the Okinawans continually maintain with Chinese, particularly between the 14th and 17th centuries, has been usually viewed as the golden age of Okinawa's pre-modern history. So I'm going to take a break from the essay and give myself a moment to reflect on some of the things I've learned already. This was the first time ever seeing the argument made that the term translated into empty, as far as karate goes, was possibly more associated with Zen than a physically empty, not holding any weapon type of hand. Linking that theory to Funakoshi's quotes of clearing your mind and having clear reflections of self is brilliant. This would also be a cultural condition, as we were talking about in the very beginning, that a traditional martial arts is about helping improve yourself, that this would also be carried out with that in mind. Up until reading this part of the essay, I had an understanding that Okinawan culture was greatly influenced by China and Japan, but never to this extent. And it was also interesting to me to learn that the first time Okinawa emerged in the literature was around 753 on a ship that was wrecked from Naha to China. So now we're going to move forward into the essay to about the 17th century, around 1609. It was in the invasion of the Shimatsu clan from Satsuma in 1609 that changed Okinawa's relationships with others forever. This invasion began a series of events that gradually led to the crumbling of the domain of the Sho kings and their legacy. Although this was not the first time Okinawa had been forcibly occupied, this one was different. This one would not be a temporary occupation. The political and economic interest of the Shimatsu seemed to be a long-standing one, which ultimately culminated in a complete and official annexation of the Ryukyu archipelago along with Okinawa by 1879, thereby committing its fate virtually into the hands of the Japanese. Okinawan culture and its history therefore became subsumed as part of a political and ideological monolith that established their domination either through vague mythical claims of ancestral legitimacy or through sheer military aggression. Framed within political rhetoric and colonizing agendas, they were thinly disguised as a moral imperative on the part of the Japanese authorities. This domination of Okinawa was a direct challenge to the Chinese and potential Western interest in the Ryukyu archipelago, and it is one that has never been successfully answered back. So there you go. You are now armed with a cultural, historical, political, and ideological backdrop of the changing tides and influences that the Okinawans have been through, and now we're going to take all of that and look at karate. The next part of this thesis is titled Hands, Hands Everywhere. This history of karate must therefore be contextualized and understood within this social-political backdrop of Okinawan's historical relations with its larger and more powerful neighbors. Much of karate's creation and subsequent development, along with the changing interpretations of its practice, in fact, parallels much of Okinawan's own historical fate. Throughout a history of intercultural political and military exchanges, the evolution of what we understand as karate in contemporary fashion has never exclusively possessed anything pure Chinese, pure Japanese, or Okinawan origins per se. In this regard, the origins and development of karate must be viewed as part of a matrix of intertwining cultural and political dialogues that can never in a strict sense be understood via simple and selective history of any single society. In this next paragraph, I had to pause because Dr. Tan uses a phrase that I use here all the time, self-acclaimed grandmasters. And I'm usually referring to it as they appear in our culture today, or whenever they decide to brand or rebrand themselves or their products. Since I recently did a podcast on mindfulness when the moment sucks, that would be like saying John Kabat-Zinn is the Grand Master of mindfulness, which is ridiculous. In several previous Kung Fu podcast episodes, I talk about lineages and how lineages are very often very poor representations of historical fact. Often, they are purposeful misrepresentations of the truth. They carry political and economical weight. They help promote legends, provide cultural benefit, and they also help spread lies. They're sometimes used as a disciplinary tool, like a parent that threatens a child to cut him out of the wheel. The other thing that lineages help to do is they help create one more self-acclaimed grandmaster, men who will come up and make up a system out there in the garage to sell. According to Dr. Tan, the deep research into karate origins has similar problems. Let's go back to his essay, where he was saying that you cannot look at the origins and development of karate and be selective of any one single society, and that taken from this perspective, one must accept the possibility of unearthing objective resources pertaining to karate's origins is extremely difficult and very often anecdotal. In spite of the growing proliferation of self-acclaimed grandmasters during the second half of the 20th century, few written reliable records can be found. Once more, any contemporary claims to an utterly irrefutable recollection regarding the origins of karate, whether it's technical or social-cultural, by a supposed authority, must always be treated with great caution. It is with such an understanding that one must refrain from any overgeneralization of a historical and political reality that is often more fuzzy than what many popular writers may state. Much of karate's social memory until the 20th century appears to have been transmitted by the use of loosely structured and rather sketchy oral histories. These vague histories have effectively entwined themselves within the contemporary imagination and the media. These oral histories and the lack of objective data, like a stele carved in the 18th century, for example, which you don't find, makes real contemporary scholarship difficult to execute. This fact contributes to a nesting ground for unscrupulous kinds of scholarship that only offers shallow insights from an ideological point of view. These slick profit seekers often adopt a veneer of scholarly prose that haven't explored the facts and have sweeping conclusions. End of paragraph. My translation of that is Dr. Tan is pointing to several people who seem to present themselves as if they've researched the histories, but all they've done is regurgitated misty facts, depending upon how they want these so-called facts to look. Where Dr. Tan is getting ready to go now is he's going to take a modern dig into the Bubishi. This should be interesting because he's already presented and argued his cases respectfully and thoughtfully, and he has done his research. If you look at his notes, he went through a lot. He writes, perhaps one of the most popularly referenced written records may be the claim of a text of somewhat nebulous origin known as the Bubishi, which a number of karateka were alleged to have gained inspiration from in the 19th century. According to Patrick McCarthy and other researchers, such as Stanley Hennings in 2001, more specific claims from this text links karate's origins to White Crane's Fist and the Shaolin Luhan Fist from China. At this point, Dr. Tan has another reference note in regards to the Shaolin Luhan Fist, and the reference note speaks to one of the most original forms of power and influence, the scholarly ability to translate. Dan Carlin speaks about this at Hardcore History, particularly in the episode The Prophets of Doom, where the Catholic Church held all the power, deciding what ancient texts would be translated and how they would be translated. The rest of us, if we had any spiritual hope, were at the mercy of those translations. So that if they told you that the Word of God said this, then you better get on board. Then came Martin Luther, who got sick of it, and he translated the text from his perspective and made them available for every commoner so that they could read the Word of God as well. But even then you are at the mercy of Martin Luther's well-intended translation. It is this good intention that is so important. I like how the martial arts researchers greatly respect one another's efforts and work, but they also dispassionately point to an oversight or another perspective without attacking the integrity of the scholar. The reason that Dr. Tan left the term Shaolin Lu Han in his thesis is because of the translation of the original term Lu Han. His notes say, quote, McCarthy actually uses the term monk fist in his text, which I find to be a rather weak translation of the Mandarin term Lu Han. I have thus retained the original usage in my article. The term Lu Han is more akin to the Buddhist term Arahat, which broadly refers to an enlightened being. Other attempted translations of this term include Buddha fist, which is just as problematic and misleading, end quote. So even though we have a text and it refers to the Shaolin and Fujian White Crane, Dr. Tan says that in spite of this, one again must remain cautious, for the act of remembering karate in a distinct textualized format did not seem to exist until the late 19th or early 20th century. And that was through the combined efforts of Okinawan karate elites and Japanese policymakers. Much of what is considered to be air quote traditional may actually be more a result of present-day conclusions based on the evidence and best reasoning. One possible hypothesis for such a situation alludes to the possibility that karate was usually practiced only by either members of the military or individuals that stem from non-elite and non-literate sections of the Okinawan society, where a culture of recording of what you were doing was either seldom accessible or it was unnecessary as part of the cultural logic. McCarthy's claims appear to support this in the recounting of the pre-Satsuma Okinawan society, where the lower classes of commoner officials were responsible for maintaining order and thus developed a system of self-defense. End of paragraph. So we can conclude from this paragraph that the majority of traditional karate was practiced by primarily the military, the commoners, and the illiterate members of society, none of which had a need or ability to record what they were doing. A term that will appear in the next paragraph is bakufu. It is often used interchangeably with shogunate. At New World Encyclopedia, they write, bakufu is a term used for a shogun's office or government. The term bakufu means an office in the tent or field headquarters. It also implies that this battlefield office was meant to be temporary. Shogun was a military rank and the historical title of the feudal administrator who served as the emperor's military deputy and actual ruler of Japan from the 12th until the 19th century. And then there is the term bushi, which is very similar and can refer to the samurai. In the essay, Dr. Tan says that it appears that the practice of the martial arts in Okinawan society never attained the same level of cultural respectability or political clout in the same manner that the bushi had developed among themselves since the emergence of the bakufu during the Kamakura shogunate in the 12th century Japan. Nonetheless, what appears to be arguably undisputed lies in the broad impact that the Chinese martial arts have had in the evolution of the karate we know today. One of the most prevailing and earliest narratives pertaining to such an entrenched relationship is the legend of Taude Sakugawa, who is attributed to be a pivotal figure in introducing Chinese influences into Okinawan's martial history. More interestingly, we know of Sakugawa by his family name and not his personal name, because Taude was really a nickname that was used to refer to his martial skill that was believed he was proficient in. Researcher McCarthy has documented his real name as Teruya Kanga, but no clear evidence is provided. The term Taude is a literal Okinawan rendering of the kanji, a loosely defined and broad label for Sakugawa's abilities that he had picked up in China. The character was also the same ideogram used to refer to the Tang Dynasty or China itself, possibly hinting to a much older link between Okinawa and Taodai even earlier than the days of Chusan's initial political ties to the Ming Dynasty since the late 14th century. Nonetheless, there are still somewhat conflicting accounts surrounding the narratives pertaining to Sakugawa, who is assumed to be a native of Shuri, the ancient capital of the Shou kings. Sakugawa was alleged to have journeyed to China during 1724 in search of instruction and expertise in the practice of Chuanfa, which literally means fist skills and is often interpreted as martial arts. Sakugawa was assumed to be lost because there wasn't any word from him for years. Then it is claimed that Sakugawa did eventually return to Okinawa with all this knowledge of Chuanfa, and then after that was referred to as Taodai Sakugawa, and his reputation grew because of his ability and his knowledge as a teacher. Other versions of the legend refer to Sakugawa as having been greatly influenced by a Chinese Chuanfa practitioner known as Kushanku. Kushanku appears to be a general term of reference to a person in authority rather than an actual name of a specific person. One could postulate that it was used broadly for various military attaches and bureaucrats. The term daimyo is given to be used as well, and it refers to a powerful feudal lord of the shogun. The story goes that Kushanku was believed to have been a Chinese visitor and lived in Okinawa sometime around 762. Kushanku taught a kata that was eventually named after him. Being a native of Shuri, the legend of Taodai Sakugawa further played a strong role in contributing to a distinct style of physical combat and cultural identity that apparently relied less on the use of weapons. It is his name often attributed to the founding of an Okinawan fighting technique that was subsequently referred to as shurite, or literally, shuri hands. Despite these vague accounts that are virtually impossible to substantiate, the period in which this is recounted interestingly parallels a period in history in which Okinawa was constantly under the yoke of the Satsuma Daimyo since 1609. The explicit use of the term te in describing their martial practice may have gained currency in the wake of a shuri swordsmith ban, which was then followed by a complete ban of all weapons in 1669. So this is where I'm going to put a bookmark in the essay. We have brought into account important Okinawan karate characters of history and of legend, with the broadening of understanding of terms, perspectives, political agendas, cultural changes, and all kinds of military stuff that was going on, and the Okinawans were caught in the crosshairs of some pretty big powers. This bookmark was set with the historical figure of Taodai Sakugawa, the development of shurite karate, and a Chinese fist skill practitioner called Kushanku, though this seems to be a term of reverence than of name. In the next episode, the thesis is going to explore the Chinese influence of Okinawan karate further. Then Dr. Tan's focus will turn to the Nahite and Tamurite forms of karate. Other headings researched in this thesis that are coming up: emptying of Chinese hands, beyond Okinawa, creating a martial tradition. And then we'll be looking at Dr. Tan's closing arguments and conclusions, which I believe I will have all wrapped up for you in the next podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 89, where we explored the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts, and in particularly the martial arts that's one of the best known in the whole world, that of karate, where it started, how it got influenced through the course of time, and by who. I hope you've enjoyed the episode, and I'll be talking with you again real soon.